I can't never remember if we start with a bell or not, so
I don't remember either.
I don't remember. We'll just start. How's that? We'll give it about, there we go. Here we go. All right, and we're off. Last week we started a discussion about dangers in our culture and dangers in our church culture. The idea of legalism and permissiveness, and I said how I liken that to mountain peaks. You know, over here you've got this big mountain peak that's, you know, legalism, and it's an extreme. It's way up there, and over here you've got this other extreme, and it's permissiveness, and it's just the other end of legalism, and generally how the truth of both just kind of run like a stream in the middle of the peaks of that. And it's up to us as Christians to not go to extremes or be extremists either way, because that's a dangerous precedent that we set when we do. But it's our job as Christians to discern the truth and where the truth lies and follow the truth and not be guilty of that, because to be guilty of the extremes is a lot of times making God in our own image, and we don't have that right. We don't have that privilege as human beings. It's our job, it's our place as people to conform to God's will in our life, not to mold God into what we want him to be. And to be a legalist and to be so open-minded that our brains fall out when we bend over is dangerous either way, and both are making God in our own image. And it makes it about us instead of about God. And really, when it boils right down to it, it's not about us at all. It's about God. It's about Jesus, and it's about pretty well everything but us. It's just about Him. Sometimes as people, I think we get to taking ourselves way too seriously, and we forget the pecking order of things. Y'all know what a pecking order is, right? I was raised on a farm, so I'm familiar with pecking order. Everything's got a pecking order. You know, you've got if you've got horses, you've got one horse that's always kind of the leader of the bunch. He's not always the biggest, but they're going to be a leader. Ours was a little old Shetland pony that was meaner than a gar, and he had his bluff in on everybody, but he was the boss. You know, a herd of cows has got one old cow that's usually the head, and everybody else just kind of falls in line. So it's pecking order, and so we, as people, we need to realize our place in the pecking order of this. We are the creatures. We are not the Creator, and therefore we have to follow the Creator. The Creator's will, what the Creator wants from us, not what we want from the Creator. We talked about how legalism last week, about how you get so caught up in the rules, and you start making rules, and rules are easy to manipulate. And we see an example of the Pharisees, of how they manipulated rules and therefore made God in their own image because of the rules that they had, and that's all God became, was just this set of rules. And we see that in our culture today, about how we just have this set of rules that you know, that we got this checklist that we follow, and if we check this box, and if we check this box, and we check this box, it's okay. And that's not what God is. God is more than just a set of rules. Our salvation is more than a checklist. We see that law was nailed to the cross. The Old Testament law was a set of rules, and it didn't work. It couldn't work. But God's easily manipulated that way. Legalism is based on fear. It's just fear. And there's a difference in just being plumb afraid of God and having a healthy fear of God, or a biblical fear of God. And legalism is just based on fear. And a lot of people that I know that are legalistic are so afraid of doing anything wrong that they don't do anything at all. And they're just kind of string halted because they're just so afraid that if they do anything that God's just going to throw a lightning bolt down on them and just poof, and that's going to be it. And so they don't do anything. That's not what God is. That's not what God's grace is about. That's not what God's love is about. Because perfect love does what to fear? Yeah, drives out, casts out fear. To have a healthy love and a healthy biblical fear of God is not just being so afraid that he's going to do it, and if you don't hit that checklist, that's not what it's about. But on the other extreme, that's enough on legalism. On the other extreme, we have the permissiveness. This idea that God that we can just do whatever we want to do and God's going to be fine with it. That we can live any way we want to live, that we can just go out and be any way we want to be, and that, and God's just like some kind of cosmic Santa Claus, and he's going to be okay with whatever we decide to do. And that's not a healthy view of God either, because that's not what God is. That's making us, again, taking ourselves too seriously, and while you've got the legalism that's so been on fear and being afraid and being just, worried about God all the time and wringing your hands and hoping that you're going to make it. This other is not showing enough reverence to God. It's not having that healthy biblical fear of God, not showing God the reverence that he deserves as our Creator, as our Father. And so we see that other extreme of permissiveness. What's the version of God like? What's the permissive version of God like?
God is love, so I'll love anything I do.
Yeah. And that's not a healthy view of love either, which we'll get into that. You going to say something?
Anything goes.
Anything goes, yeah. Anything goes. It's this God that you see on a lot of these mega church TV shows. It's just kind of a cosmic, just kind of a vague God that he's just an advice giver, and it's just anything that you want to do is fine. And this idea that love, God is but is love always just permissiveness? Sometimes love is hard, isn't it? Sometimes love is tough. When I was growing up, my mom told me when I got to running around, and I was just a kid. Kid's going to be a kid, right? And I was doing some things that I shouldn't do, and she knew it, and I thought I was getting away with more than I was really getting away with. And my mama told me, she said, if you land yourself in jail, she said, don't call me. She said, you'll get out when they let you out. Don't call me. Now, I'm going to save you all the trouble, because every time I've told this story, I've had somebody come up to me and tell me, well, your mama, she said that, but she would have came and got you. No, sir. If you believe that about my mama, you don't have any idea about Cindy Darnell, because that's not how she rolled. Now, she would have cried, and it would have broke her heart. And she would have prayed for me, but the last thing in the world she would have done is came and got me, because she wasn't an enabler. She wasn't a rescuer. And she knew that if I got myself into that situation, the thing that I needed was to set my hind end in jail until I got out. That's what you call breaking you from sucking eggs. And that's exactly how it would have happened. And I knew it because, like I said, the first time I taught this class, that my mama never lied to me. And she wouldn't have started in. Sometimes love is tough. Love's not always just about just letting you do whatever you want to do. That's really not love. About the best definition of love that I ever heard was seeking someone's greatest good. I always liked that definition. I heard a preacher say that one time, and I like that definition of love, to seek someone's greatest good. And sometimes that greatest good is tough. It's having that hard conversation with a brother or sister or a family member. It's tough, but it's no less love. And so the idea that this, permissive idea of just being able to do whatever and love is love and all, it just don't work that way. Yes.
God's word says he disciplines those he loves.
Yes. But we don't want to talk about that. We don't like talk about discipline, and so, but yeah, that's right. He does. He humbles us sometimes. If we need a humbling, we're going to get a humbling. I mean, that's just the way it works. But this idea of a vague higher power and just there to help us live a better life and to be more open-minded and to be more kind, it's not a healthy view of God. It's just you can do whatever. Don't bring up sin. Don't bring up accountability. Don't bring up, let's don't talk about hell. We can't talk about that. I had a lady one time. I was preaching up at Boydsville, a little old country church, about 6 people there, and there's a little old lady there that looked like she was weaned on a dill pickle. And she was just awful looking. And I use humor. I use humor to keep people's attention because that's just what I try to do, because it kind of keeps it light. And I made her smile, and that was the worst thing in the world I could have done. And it made her mad that I made her smile during the sermon. And after it was over, she pulled me outside and she said, I don't understand you young preachers. All y'all want to talk about is heaven, heaven, heaven. We need to hear us a good sermon on hell, And while I'm not to that extreme, because I told her, I said, well, my grandmother told me one time that you get more flies with honey than you do vinegar. And I believe that, we have to have a good view of the fact that hell is real. And I wasn't really preaching heaven, heaven, heaven either, but hell is real. But we don't want to talk about that. We can't talk about that. We can't talk about accountability. We forget sometimes what God is, and when we do that's a form of idolatry. When we just think that God is not God, when we change the personality of God because it doesn't fit our lifestyle, that's idolatry. That's straight out of Romans 1, which we're going to get to in a minute if you want to go ahead and be turning there. That whole Romans 1 thing of the creature trying to become the creator. That's making ourselves God. We see this in our schools, in our places of higher learning. Professors teaching our kids that they are their own moral standing. They are their own moral compass. How dangerous is that? That's very dangerous. Because if this mentality that if it's okay with me, if I want to do it, and if it feels good to me and it doesn't hurt anybody, that it's okay, that's setting an awful dangerous precedent. It really is. We only have one standard, and what standard's that? The Word of God. That's the standard. Remember what I said last week, how my friend Rick Dickinson trained his troopers to identify a false bill? Look at a real one. Study a real one. That's the standard. The gospel, the Bible, the Word of God is the standard. It's the real deal. But sometimes we don't want to study that because it doesn't fit our mentality. It doesn't fit our lifestyle. It doesn't fit what we want. I say this, I almost said this new, but it's not new. Folks is folks. Nothing new under the sun, really. Folks have always kind of wanted to bend things to fit them. We see it in the first century. We see it today. This idea that I'm going to do what I want to do and God's going to be fine with it. This permissive mentality of I can go to church or I can do whatever I want and I'm closer to God on a mountain and all that stuff that we've talked about before. But that's not what God says. God gave us a church family for a reason. We need to be around other Christians. We need to be around each other. But we see there's a point that we just keep pushing and pushing God away, and eventually what does God just do? Huh? Yeah, he goes away.
draw near to God and he will draw near to you.
Yeah. And we see it over and over in the Old Testament. This, you know, when the children of Israel started having it good, you know, that they would start and they would get further away from God and they would drift God away from God, and they'd start with their idolatry and they'd make these idols and they'd just push God away, and then God would just say, okay, you don't want me there, fine. And what usually happened? It wasn't very pretty, was it? There was always a problem. And they'd turn back to God for a while, and then everything would be rosy, and then everything would be getting too good, and then they'd start pushing God away again, and eventually, what would God do? He'd leave them again. Yes, ma'am.
Don't you think that it is the people that leave God? He's always there, but we're the ones that walk away.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I reckon so. Yeah. But I think there's a point that he quits dealing with us. Yeah, he allows it. I told Kyle a story one time about Cody, my little boy. Or he ain't little, he's 23 years old now, but he's still my boy. We was eating breakfast one morning, and Angie made oatmeal or cream, probably cream of wheat, because I'm not a big oatmeal guy. But I'm sitting here trying to eat, and Cody, he's at an age, he's only, you know, a couple of years old. He's trying to stick his hand down in that cream of wheat to eat it, because, well, he wasn't using a spoon yet. So I was trying to eat because I could eat it hot. He couldn't. I'd reach over there and I'd take his hand. I'd say, no, don't do that. It's going to burn you. Leave that alone. You let it cool down a little bit. And I'd try to go back to eat. Next thing I know, that little fella was sticking his hand down that bowl again. And I'd take that hand. Now leave that alone. That's going to get you. It's going to burn you. It's going to hurt you. Now leave it alone. And that went on for a while. Well, finally, I got tired of it because I'm trying to eat, and this little turkey, he's on my nerves, you know. And so I just let him stick his hand down that bowl. And sure enough, he screamed out crying. Angie got mad at me because I'd let Cody burn himself. But, you know, there just comes a point that the lesson needs to be learned, and I think that's what God does. I really do. You know, you just keep on, you keep on. Finally, God just backs up and says, put your hand in it. And he lets you, and then you burn, you know. And that's just the way it is. Sometimes God's permissiveness is his wrath. And we see it in our culture today. You know, so many people have forgotten God. So many people have turned away from God. Have forgotten the gospel of God and what the gospel is really all about. That they, you know, that God's just to a point that he's just put your hand in it, you know, and allows those things to happen. We as a people need to be righteous. What's the definition of righteous?
Pleasing to God.
Huh?
Pleasing to God.
Pleasing to God, just, moral, merciful, honest, fair, any of these things, fair, compassionate, one to be right with God, a reflection of God, not God being a reflection of us. That's humanizing God, and we see pagan cultures have done this for ages. You know, I can't remember what I said last week. I think I might have said it, but I'll say it again, because if I can't remember it, y'all probably can't either. But pagan cultures they make their gods, and their gods have human traits. You know, you see the Greek gods, you see the Roman gods, the Norse gods, all these false gods. They have human traits. You know, they're a higher power, but they have their jealousies and they have their anger and they have all this, and so they're really made out of the image of man. Rather than as we as Christians, we're made in the image of God. And there's a very distinct difference in that, I believe, because, you know, it's not about it. God don't have the hang-ups that we have. God's perfect. God's perfect in his holiness, and we're to be holy like God. And what's holy mean?
Set apart.
Set apart. To be set apart, to be different. It's an otherness. we're not to be used for things that are common. When I was growing up, we had the dishes, we had dog bowls, we had all these things, and we didn't eat out of the dog bowls. We had out of the regular dishes. See, we're not dog bowls. We're not to use ourselves for something common, for scraps. We're to be holy. We're to be set apart. So we still need the gospel today because man has forgotten God. For the most part, our culture has just completely forgotten God. And this idea of enlightenment, that we can do whatever we want to do, and if there is a God, he's just going to be okay with it. But we've forgotten the God, so we've forgotten God, so we still need the gospel. Anthropology and science teaches an upward evolution from animism, from brutality, and just being the survival of the fittest, and just this evolution that would come to, and it's turned away from God. That we don't come from God, that God doesn't exist. And I really, it's hard for me to wrap my head around that. Rob took me up on a mountain mule deer hunting this past year, and as I looked down across that plain and I saw the mountains off in the distance, man alive, I never seen anything more beautiful in my life. How can somebody look at something like that and not realize God? How can somebody look into the eyes of a child, of a newborn baby, and not realize God, not recognize that God is, and be humbled by that and be moved by that? But yet many times we see folks that they just don't, because they're in their mind that things have become so open and so okay that we've just totally forgotten and drifted away from God. Idolatry we see is selfishness, isn't it? It's just selfishness because it makes it about us. It doesn't make it about God anymore. It makes it about us. And selfishness is a bad thing to have and to be caught up with. There's a friend of mine from Arkansas, is a preacher named Tim Woolridge, and one of his favorite sayings was that everybody wants Jesus to be the Savior of their souls, but there's not very many people that want him to be Lord of their life. And that's a very profound statement. That we want him to save us. We want us to take us to heaven, but we don't want to submit to his lordship. And we can't have it both ways. It just don't work. We can't have it both ways. We have to submit to his lordship. We have to submit to his will. If he is our king, he's my king, and I dearly love him. Do y'all sing that here? And so the idea of having a king is to submit to that king. And if we're going to expect to be saved, we have to be submissive to his will. I love freedom. I reckon we all do, don't we? We need the gospel. We need to submit to God's will. And the idea of submitting to someone else's will or submitting to God's will and being free, it almost seems like an oxymoron, don't it? But we have to remember our place in the pecking order. Our place in the pecking order is we are the creature, and we're going to follow something. We're going to follow something whether we like it or not, and it's either going to be God and his will, or it's going to be what? Self. And to follow self is to follow Satan. So we're going to follow something. We're going to have a shepherd. We're sheep. And I don't know if y'all have ever been around sheep very much, but bless their hearts. Sheep aren't the very smartest animals, are they? They're very dependent. They have to have a shepherd. They wouldn't make it without it. So if we're going to be likened to sheep, we're going to have a shepherd, and that shepherd's either going to be Jesus or it's going to be the world. It's just that simple. And if we want to know freedom, if we want to have freedom, which true freedom is freedom from sin, right? out of the bondage of sin and into the grace of God, that's true freedom. You know, growing up, there was a saying growing up of men that you know, didn't follow anybody's rules, didn't follow God's rules, that they were free-living men. Have y'all ever heard that saying, free-living men? I've got some uncles that are that way, they're free-living men. But they're not really free because they don't know God. They don't know the freedom that comes through Jesus Christ. They're not free from sin. They're not free from the bondage of sin. They're just rebellious. They live in open rebellion of the gospel, and they don't truly know freedom. And every time I turn around, this thing's turning off on me. I need to set my screen a little bit more. You know, folks like not having rules or limitations, so they tend to make God in their own image because they want to be free. And how many times have you talked to somebody or heard somebody say, well, you know, the Bible and God's rules they're just so archaic and outdated. Has anybody else ever heard that in discussion or had a discussion with somebody? And I think that's so wrong. You know, because it's not about, you know, it's not outdated. It's not archaic. It's just as alive, and it's just as vibrant. It's just as beautiful today as it was on that you know, day in Acts 2, where the first gospel sermon was preached, and all those people obeyed the gospel. You know, but we allow our culture to influence. We allow our culture to speak and say, well, it's just outdated. Well, it can't be. It's like saying, you know, it's just old. We need to put it away. It doesn't work that way. God is eternal, and God's word is eternal. God's gospel is eternal. Yes, ma'am.
I also think about, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. And also, I mean, man, it has been, always will be the same. And God knows us. You know, the older I get, the more amazed I am as I look at his word and what he asks of us and what he knows us. And he should, as the creator.
Oh, yeah.
The creation. So he knows us. And we're not any different than people were at the beginning.
Oh, yeah, no. Folks is folks. They're the same now as they've always been, you know. And yeah, God knows us. What was it David said in the Psalms, that God knew us while we were being formed in the womb, you know? He knows every little old thing about us. And every hair on our head. He knows us better than we know ourselves, because we can lie to ourselves even, but we can't lie to God. Yes?
I think the people you were talking about, they're trying to make the New Testament into a set of rules like the Old Testament. And they say, oh, well, that rule doesn't apply, but they don't understand the reason for the rule. And the
Yes.
reason is just as valid now as it ever was.
Yes. Yeah, just because we've got these now, you know, we walk around with computers in our pockets, you know, we're still people. We're still people, and that doesn't change. And yeah, but people want to make rules because they can take the rules, and again, they can manipulate those rules, and they can discard the rule if it don't fit them, or if they don't like it, or whatever, to make it fit what they want, and not realizing that God's not putting those rules there to punish us. God's not putting those rules there to hurt us. What's God putting those rules there for?
To keep us safe.
Yeah. Yeah, when you go by a schoolyard and you see a fence, is that fence there to imprison them kids? You know, is it there to punish those kids because the kids need to be free. They need to roam free. Take that fence down. What's that fence there for? Keep them safe. It's there to protect them little kids. It keep predators out, human and animal. Keep them from running out in the street and getting run over. It's there to protect them. Are we not God's children? There again, we get taking ourselves way too seriously and thinking we can handle it, but really we can't. We need protecting. And God sets those rules up, and he says this, don't do this because it'll hurt you if you do. And we in our rebellion, we in our humanness, we in our carnal minds, as Jim Thomason would say, we get to wanting to do what we want to do, and we want to fence it down because, hey, really, if sin wasn't any fun, nobody'd do it, right?
John Wayne syndrome. I don't need God, I can do it myself.
Yeah.
No, you can't.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah. But yeah, those rules are there for a reason. They're there to protect. It's kind of like the laws of the land. See, some people get in the mentality of the laws that we live by as citizens, the laws are there to punish. Well, the laws aren't there to punish. The laws are there to protect. And it's just that simple. So we have to kind of have a change in the mind on that. When we look at the attributes of God, and we see the personality of God, we see just how God is. And I've been kind of struggling. I started this class a little bit early. Do we want to talk about who we are, or would y'all like to talk about who God is? I've been kind of on the fence about which way to go with the class, because sometimes I think we forget who we are, and I know a lot of times we forget who God is. So which way y'all want to go with this? Y'all ain't much help.
She said both, she just didn't want to say
Both? Okay. All right, well, we'll just look at a little bit of both then. Because if we look at the attributes of God and study the personality of God and just study God, I think it helps us to realize maybe who we are too, because we forget that. We forget those attributes. We forget that holiness, that otherness that makes up God, that God is in His personality. And I know our culture's forgot it, because it's just, again, this vague higher power that's just kind of an advice giver, and it's kind of a, that if you just do what's good, and if you're just nice to your neighbor, that everything's okay, and that's not exactly what it's all about. We kind of forget about God being our Father, about God being our King, about Him being our Lord, and I think that's dangerous to do that. Without God, what are we?
Lost.
Without the gospel, yeah. Without God's rules, we can get pretty depraved. When we walk away from God, things get real bad. And so we still need the gospel. We need a healthy view of God. We need a healthy fear of God because of the depravity that comes without Him. That can set in without having that healthy view of God. Can you imagine living in a society where this is the norm of not having God? So I had an atheist drummer one time, and after every time we played music, it was always an hour discussion about these things and about how God is so ingrained in Christianity. I believe is so ingrained in our culture that we don't realize that the very basis of good, the very basis of treating your neighbor and loving your neighbor as yourself, of how bad it can get without God. We see in history how bad it can get without God over and over again. But in our culture, in our society as Americans, we forget how bad it can be. I say we forget. We don't know how bad it can be because our culture is so ingrained with Christianity that we can't imagine the depravity that comes without it. We see the children of Israel when they got so far away from God that they were putting their babies and burning their babies alive as sacrifice. Now, can you imagine a culture that gets so far away from God that they would do something like that? But we can become so depraved if we don't have God, of living in fear, of not being able to trust anyone, and this downward spiral permissiveness. You know, there's folks out there today that are claiming pedophilia as a sexual orientation. You know, how far do we need to go? You know, and whose responsibility is it to turn these things around? Huh? Ours. I mean, if we're not going to do it, who's going to? You know, we get comfortable sometimes and we forget that we're all ministers of the gospel. We forget that we are the ones that are supposed to be taking the word out. And we're the ones that are supposed to be teaching, and we're the ones that are supposed to be living an example for those and turning this thing around. You know, but folks get so caught up in their life and their will sometimes that we do forget that. And Israel didn't understand it. You know, there was a cartoon. I'm going to show my age here. There was a cartoon. Well, I say show my age. It ain't like my gray hair don't show my age. But there was a cartoon named Jimmy Neutron back, you know, years ago. And there was an episode of Jimmy Neutron that where these kids, where the parents were just being so overbearing to them, and the parents were being, you know, making them eat good food. And the parents were making them go to bed early, and the kids were doing all these things, and the kids were just tired of it. The kids were tired of the parents telling them what to do, and so they just said, well, we just wish the parents would just go away. Well, so I can't remember exactly what it was because I am getting old. But anyway, it just poof, all of a sudden the parents were gone. The kids could do whatever they wanted to do. They could eat all the junk food. They could stay up as long as they wanted. They could just do whatever in the world. Well, it didn't take long till they started getting sick because they weren't eating healthy. You know, they was eating all this junk and they just felt bad. They were tired because they were just, you know, they were tired because they wouldn't go to bed and they wasn't getting any rest, and so they were eating this junk, not getting rest, and it just spiraled downhill really bad. And it really got so bad that they started wishing their parents would be back again, you know. Well, at the end of the episode, of course, they came back and everything kind of got back to neutral, but I watched that with the kids and I was like, hey, look here, you know, without God, we're just kind of like kids without parents. You know, we run around, we do what we want to do, and it doesn't take long. We realize that, hey, this ain't as fun as we thought it was going to be. We might need to do something else, you know. And so permissiveness is just as bad as legalism. This permissive mentality that God just let us do whatever we want to do is just as bad as legalism that we talked about last week in you know, just making God into a set of rules and just being, you know, so hate-filled and being so scared to do something wrong that we don't do anything at all. And this idea, I told a story about the lady that, you know, I talked to. She said, well, I hope, you know, she just, you know, and just this idea of just wringing your hands. That's not really hope, is it? You know, hope is more than just hoping that you make it, because that has to do with fear, you know. But then the permissive mentality of not having a healthy respect of God is just as dangerous. Next week, I guess we'll start looking more into the personality of God and who we are and who we should be as children of God. I'm about out of stuff. Has anybody got any questions, comments, exhortations, admonitions, or confessions?
I'm still hung up on winged on a pickle, so.
Winged on a dill pickle. I'm surprised you hadn't ever heard that one. Me and Kyle was raised in kind of the same area, so he kind of understands some of the language that I talk, even though he was across the river in Illinois, you know. But nothing else. All right, yes, sir.
You know, in Romans 15:4, Paul wrote, whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that through patience and comfort of the Scriptures we might have hope. And that hope is an expectant desire. We have hope, but it's not just a wish.
Yes. It's a whole different whole different animal than what our culture, and well, I say our culture, I shouldn't say that, our language. Our language uses hope in a totally different context than what hope really is. It's kind of like watching a ball game and hoping your team will win, because even though you hope, there's that little bit of doubt there that they might not. Yeah, the hope that's talking about right there is a guarantee. It doesn't have any doubt in it whatsoever. It's a guarantee. So yes, thank you. Yeah. Appreciate y'all's comments and attention.